Final Fantasy VI's reputation precedes it. It's nearly expected to be seen at the top of any best RPGs list, and anyone who played it at the time of release raves about what a step forward it was for video games. People champion this game not only as one of the best Final Fantasy games or the best Super Nintendo role-playing game, but like I mentioned, some go as far as to say it's one of the greatest role-playing games ever made. But why is that? Well, maybe just starting the game can shed some light on the situation. You're immediately told that magic has been almost entirely eradicated from this world, and shortly after you see some empire controlling a girl with an item called the Slave Crown. Then you witness this somber scene of 3 soldiers marching through the snow in their mechs. The thematic and environmental contrast the beginning of this game has with previous Final Fantasy games is immediately noticeable, and it runs with this trend for the rest of the game. Final Fantasy IV began with a fleet of airships soaring over the sea, 5 had a king flying away from his castle on a dragon. The first scene of 6 introduces the game's unique industrial setting and sets the tone for the rest of the game and what it has to offer. And it's not just dark and new, it's bigger and bolder than any previous Final Fantasy game. It provides so much variety in its gameplay, it truly feels like a step forward for both the series and the genre, and you see this pretty early. You start the game controlling Terra, but very shortly after, she collapses and you begin to play as Locke. You'll hop between playable characters and parties frequently when you're early in the game, which allows for more dynamic storytelling by showcasing it through many different perspectives. Anyway, when I said you see the variety this game has to offer early on, I really meant it. Immediately after gaining control of Locke, you're thrust into this, real-time strategy segment. You have 3 parties to control, and you have to defeat the enemy commander while preventing any soldiers from reaching Terra. Final Fantasy V had something similar to this with its Fort Tower, requiring you to split up your party into 2 groups to climb the 2 towers at the same time, but it's cleaned up a lot more here. The 2 towers in 5 had very specific enemies which required specific jobs or strategies to overcome, but the split party in 6 is much more open-ended by having simpler enemies and more parties to control. After gaining some allies, your scrappy resistance group that's sticking it to the Castalian Empire journeys towards Narsh through a river on a raft. As the raft floats, you'll come across forks in the road where you're prompted to choose a path. The goal is to pick the shortest route to minimize fighting and keep your fragile oracle safe. Having this kind of control is another example of keeping the gameplay fresh, and at the end of the river, you face the recurring boss Ultros for the first time. As you fight him, he rattles off insults and other commentary. He even spouts specific insults about your party members before attacking them, like, "Muscleheads, hate 'em!" And if you cast fire on him, he'll say, "Youch, seafood soup!" Upon defeating Ultros, the group is separated, and then there's some omniscient narrating, like an interlude in a play. You now get to play through 3 campaigns, starring the different people you've met thus far, in any order you want. Locke's story is less about fighting. He has to sneak around right under the Empire's nose, and you'll have to do some puzzle solving to move about without being squashed by the ridiculously overpowered guards in the area. Terra's story has the bulk of the party members and has you exploring the destination at the end of the river, so it feels the most familiar. Sabin's chapter is more about story than anything else. You'll shortly gain control of Cyan, a new character, until him and Sabin's paths intertwine, leading him to join up. This stretch of the game, from the Returner's hideout to these 3 distinct chapters, is one of the most memorable parts of the game, because it shows what Final Fantasy VI is all about. The first 2/3 of the game are a joy to play through, because there's little surprises along the critical path that never overstay their welcome, while the story unfolds and grows in size as you keep playing. Later on your journey, you look for Terra in a town named Zozo. She's supposed to be at the top of a tower, but when you climb this building, there's a wall blocking the stairs that lead higher up. As you climb, however, you'll notice this guy flinging himself from building to building like a monkey. When I first encountered him, I thought he was just an elaborate set piece, but it's really a subtle clue on how to progress. You're supposed to walk up to these openings and hold direction on the D-pad to leap from one side to the other. The solution to this puzzle is never forced onto you, it really gives you that aha moment. Being able to traverse the world like this, and even more so, having NPC sprites move in such dramatic ways outside of a cutscene, is not just impressive, but it remedies the issue of forgettable towns in role-playing games. After all, it's hard to forget a place when you vaulted from skyscraper to skyscraper like you were playing Mirror's Edge. And of course, I'd be remiss not to recognize what some consider one of the most iconic moments in RPG history, the Opera House. Long story short, the group needs an airship, and the only way that's gonna happen is if Celeste, one of your party members, masquerades as the famous actor Mariah during an opera performance. You get to prepare by reading the script beforehand, then you'll be quizzed on the correct lyrics as Celeste sings. There are these MIDI sound effects made to sound like voices, which more or less correspond with the syllables of the lyrics on screen, while Celeste and her fellow actors perform and move around the stage. The funny thing is, despite how much emotional connotation the words have in this performance, there's not a whole lot of meaning behind them. And of course, in the middle of the opera, Ultros makes a return with as many japes as before. I really like how he says out loud that it'll take him 5 minutes to drop a weight from the rafters before the timer starts. The negligible amount of meaning that's here got somewhat lost in the original translation. Yet, despite how little narrative importance the scene has, it doesn't detract from my enjoyment of it at all. That's because when I think back on Final Fantasy VI, it's not the story or even the characters that come to mind. It's these little episodic moments that left an impression on me. Now that's not to say there isn't much to be commended about this game's story and cast, because it's teeming with ambition. Let's start with the characters. There's 14 playable characters, the most in any game in the series. What I find most impressive about the cast is how some of them behave in battle. Each character has a special battle command that's unique to them, and this goes a long way to distinguishing them from each other. There are some basic commands that you've seen before, like steal or throw, but then you have Cyan's sword tech. When you activate it, a bar starts to slowly fill up, and pressing A at different checkpoints will result in different attacks. Activating it early will result in weaker attacks, but if you wait for it to fill up, you can't give your other party members commands while Cyan is preparing himself. Or you have Setzer and his slot machine. Depending on the symbols you line up, you can get a variety of useful effects, one of which is called Bahamut, the most powerful summon in the game. And my personal favorite is Sabin's Blitz attacks. Once you select Blitz, you have to complete an input akin to a special move in a fighting game. These Blitz attacks are always better than a standard attack, but require memorization and proper execution to pull off. Like you may have to press RL, XY, right, left, A, or perform a full circle on the D-pad. These 3 battle commands specifically involve risk-reward scenarios that make battles much more interesting, but more importantly, they depart from a solely menu-based combat system. The job system in Final Fantasy V was certainly enjoyable, but I think it was a tad limited by sticking entirely to menu-based actions. At the end of the day, even with different jobs and attacks and spells, you were just getting more things to click A on to yield different results. Final Fantasy VI takes admittedly small steps to fixing this, because these commands require both judgment and precision to pull off. This makes every battle, especially boss battles, more engaging than any previous Final Fantasy game to me. Trying to do a quarter circle on your D-pad as quickly as possible, or trying to time a spinning slot without messing up is a kind of feeling you just don't get from pressing a single button to attack. There's a couple more party members worth mentioning, both of which happen to be optional characters in the game. Go-Go is a mime, and getting him is a blast. You have to get your whole party swallowed in a fight with the Zone Eater, which will lead you to a new area in its stomach. Go-Go joins you seemingly for no reason in the SNES version, but it's a bit more interesting in the Game Boy Advance port. Go-Go claims to be a master of mimicry, and wants to exercise his skills by copying the party's strongest desire, saving the world. Go-Go has no stake in all this hero business. They're just following their mime-like instincts and imitating the first people they've met in a long time. The motivations of the different party members are varied and rooted in different desires, but Go-Go's is actually very clever and got a laugh out of me the first time I played the game. Go-Go can't use the standard attack command, it's replaced with Mimic. Go-Go copies the last action used by a party member, whether it be a spell or an attack or a signature move. The other secret character is a Yeti named Umaro. What sets him apart, for better or for worse, is that he's a berserker. He has 4 attacks, and he'll randomly choose one whenever it's his turn to act. In other words, he can't be given any commands directly, but has higher physical stats to compensate for this. This may sound like another example of a character that behaves in a unique way during battle, but it's really the opposite. When Umaro is in your party, you only have 3 party members to control, which just leads to simpler fights with less thinking in them. Umaro has some situational uses, but he's an exception to the creative distinctions made to the other characters, because the only thing different about him is that he makes the game less fun to play. Anyway, there's more to these characters than their combat abilities, and the game does its best to make that point pretty clear. Nearly every character has a side quest, some even have multiple, like Cyan and Gao. These give some backstories to the characters, or elaborate on what you already know. Some are silly, others are serious, and some are a combination of both. There's not really a main character because everybody gets equal attention. In an interview for the magazine Edge, one of the directors, Yoshinori Kitase, said, "We began work on Final Fantasy VI with the idea that every character is the protagonist of the story. We were very keen to design a game featuring individual episodes for each character. Around the time each character initially joins your party, they usually have their own little arc, like navigating the Narsh caves with Locke or fighting your way through the Phantom Train with Shadow. I think the episodic storytelling utilized for most of the story is what makes it so memorable for a lot of people. However, the story being divided up like this may not have necessarily been a creative choice. The story was conceived in a group effort. For example, Terra and Locke were greatly colored by Hironobu Sakaguchi's influence, while Tetsuya Nomura worked on the episodes about Shadow and Setzer. Kaori Tanaka made suggestions for Edgar and Sabin, and Yoshinori Kitase created Celeste and Gao. Kitase describes one of his role as director by saying, "I was essentially given the task of unifying all the scenarios and dramatic sections in the game into a coherent narrative." Another notable thing about Final Fantasy VI is its Esper system. It departs from the job system used in almost every previous Final Fantasy game. Each character still has a job, so to speak, but that only has some influence on their stats and gives them their unique battle command. You'll find these Espers in all sorts of places, and each character can equip any one of them at any time. Having an Esper equipped allows it to be used as a summonable monster once per battle, but the most prominent effect is that new spells are learned exclusively from them. Any character can learn any spell in the game, with some taking longer to learn depending on the strength of the spell in the Esper. Plus, when equipped, it allows you to influence your stat growth when leveling up. A combination of predetermined classes for each character, and a massive amount of customization for each is wholly unique to this entry. Characters don't proceed on a set path of progression like in Final Fantasy IV, but you're not given so much control that each character becomes an identical blank slate, like in 3 and 5. Assigning Espers to your party members gets more and more exciting as you acquire Espers with extremely potent skills that you want everyone to learn, like Arise and Ultima. I personally prefer this much more than the Materia system in Final Fantasy VII. Your Esper progression is tied to each character, as opposed to your Materia leveling up separately and being able to be swapped between any character at will. Now I'd like to talk about this game's story, so if you want to avoid spoilers, skip to the timestamp on screen. Before the events of the game, a Harlequin named Kefka Palazzo was experimented on by the Gestalian Empire in an attempt to give him magical abilities. The trials were successful, but in the process, Kefka suffered brain damage that turned him into a lunatic who hungers for violence. Throughout the game, you'll see Kefka repeatedly engage in total war, often not even for the sake of stamping out potential threats to the Empire, but just because he takes sadistic pleasure in killing and destruction. He burned down Firago and almost completely wiped out the population of Doma by poisoning the water supply. When Terra was being controlled by the Empire, Kefka forced her to incinerate 50 of his own soldiers just to test Terra's power. Kefka has something of a counterpart for about half of the game, General Leo. Although they work for the same cause, Leo fights honorably and even verbally condemns Kefka's actions multiple times. Kefka, naturally, kills him. Kefka eventually goes to the lengths of godly ascension to kill even more people. For most of the game, Kefka serves under Emperor Gestal, but as soon as he's given the chance, he betrays the Emperor and empowers himself with the legendary Warring Triad. Disrupting the mystical statues also brings about a cataclysm that ravages the land and separates your party. Final Fantasy VI is ambitious in another way by having a rather dark story compared to previous entries and its contemporaries, and this is almost entirely owed to the presence of Kefka. Celeste even ends up attempting suicide after the Kefka catastrophe because she's lost all of her friends and family. Although this Harlequin stands as a minor antagonist, he eventually promotes himself to the largest threat in the world, and your final showdown against him doesn't disappoint. After rounding up everyone who is scattered across the world, you fly over to Kefka's menacing tower to show him what's what. This dungeon makes use of all those party members you've accumulated by making you split them to form 3 groups of 4 people each. You control these 3 groups separately, similar to the section with Locke and the Mughals that I mentioned earlier. After reaching the peak of the tower, you get to face off against Kefka for the last time, after wading through his pillar of minions. And I mean, just look at this. He wastes no time in spitting out an attack that reduces your entire party to 1 HP, as if the massive sprite and holy background didn't set the stage well enough. And you can't talk about this fight without mentioning the music. During all 4 phases of the fight, a song called Dancing Mad plays, which will shift depending on which part of the battle you're in. The full version of this song is 17 minutes. It's one of the most beloved songs in the franchise, and if nothing else proves my point about this game, it's this song. The scope of this game is mirrored by this gargantuan of a musical piece, which calls back to Kefka's theme in the title screen. The composer, Nobuo Uematsu, said, "Well, usually when you make a song, it's 2 to 3 minutes in length. You have the introduction, the main part, and the ending. But for Dancing Mad, I didn't really put a stop on it, so I kept on working on it, and that really let the song, I got to play around with it for something like 14 minutes, and it's really one of my favorites." Following Kefka's defeat leads to an ending that perfectly encapsulates the journey you went on. As you escape the collapsing tower, each character gets their own little scene to represent them. These pertain to their signature traits, their pasts, or their relationships to other characters. Every character has their own theme that usually plays when they first show up, and every song that's associated with a character is implemented into this ending song. You'll hear leitmotifs of every character throughout the song when they make an appearance. Without a doubt, these 10 minutes are the most thought out and heartwarming moments in the entire narrative. Sabin revealing he left his brother for good reason, Cyan overcoming his hatred for machines, even if just a little, Gogo using his mimicry to activate a mechanism, Setzer reminiscing on his past. These emphasize the character-based nature of Final Fantasy VI more than anything else. Showing the cast's growth and attachment to each other is a great way to top off the game. I just wish there was more of this stuff. There are some moments like these that really put the spotlight on the characters, like the aforementioned Opera House, but a majority of the game is the party being shuffled between plot points without giving them a chance to express themselves. The side quests available to every party member in the world of Ruin certainly help, but I really wish the characters were naturally adapted into the main story beyond their introductions. If there's one thing that defines Final Fantasy VI, it's the scope. There's an airship's worth of stuff I haven't even mentioned about this game, like every character having their own unique animation when a battle starts, newly introduced activities like the auction house and the Colosseum. This game has the largest number of summonable monsters in any Final Fantasy game. There are equipable relics that can give party members new ways to fight. Even more Mode 7 graphics! Despite all this, the game's greatest strength can be its greatest weakness at times. The size of the cast is impressive, but some of the characters are rather dull as a result. The Esper system is expansive and allows for a lot of customization, but as you progress, characters begin to feel more and more similar. By the end of the game, most of your party members will be exclusively using the best spells like Ultima and Curaga. There's a huge world for you to explore, but backtracking through it later to gather up your scattered party members really is a chore. The new direction this game takes may be due to a change in directors. The first 5 Final Fantasy games were directed by the series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi, but Final Fantasy VI was directed by Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito. Whatever the reason may be, Final Fantasy VI is endlessly praised to this day. Every single part of this game is stuffed to the gills. The plot, the music, the gameplay, and it's topped off with a perfect ending. It may not be as technically large as something like Star Ocean, I mean, there's no touching that 6 MB cartridge, but the influence of this game can still be felt to this day. The Desperation attacks are a precursor to Limit Breaks. It did mini-games earlier and better than Final Fantasy VII, and it ditched the elemental crystal plot device like Final Fantasy II. Many people think Square caught lightning in a bottle with Final Fantasy VI. For some, the experience this game provides can't be replicated, but I don't think it needs to be. All the best parts of Final Fantasy VI got sprinkled into future games in a lot of different ways, and I don't just mean for the Final Fantasy series. And beyond its influence, it's just a really solid game. It has a gripping start, a heartfelt ending, and so many twists and turns along the way that have cemented this game as one of the all-time greats.